Hey everyone, it's Joe Glines here in Dallas, Texas.
Yeah, and Jackie here from Copenhagen, Denmark.
And until the end of the apocalypse, Jackie, we're going to keep doing these. And the world goes to hell. There's 10 other people on the planet. We're like, hey everyone. Um, sorry. So I saw this email come through today, and it just struck me as what is an API and how to use one. And everyone I think knows my love of APIs. I know Jackie appreciates them a lot too.
Yeah.
My job, and especially in the history of my background in research and getting data, to me, they're awesome. And I thought this was an interesting article. We'll put the link here in the chat, but it was pretty interesting. And I like this first intro sentence, right? An API is the middleware that sits between two applications and allows them to communicate using predefined rules. In practice, APIs are typically used to allow client-side applications to access otherwise protected database.
Yeah, I read that as well. I was like, it's a good way of wording it, but not the way I would have worded it. But it does make a lot of sense, and I think it's easily graspable what an API does.
Especially the first sentence to me, I thought it was like, hey, that's as a succinct sentence. It's not bad. The next one, and that's because, and they get into this in a bit here, and it's something we've discussed in our webinars and stuff on APIs and web scraping, is APIs now, that when most people talk about APIs and you hear them by more and more common people, it's really a web service API is what they're referring to. Not like the Windows API or Python has an API, something you can connect to. It's not a program to program, it's a program to a server.
Yeah. And that's also where, because as you said yourself, the first sentence of the next one, at a high level, APIs simply establish communication between two applications.
Yeah.
And that's probably how I would have said it.
Yeah.
But that's where I kind of like the first intro part, because it says it a little differently. In a way where more people can probably process it without really knowing the back end of what an API is.
Yeah, and I like this one where they said they can't communicate. It's between two applications. Let's just stick with applications, right? You can't communicate directly because they don't have access to each other's code, so they have to run a wire between them and send signals down the line. In my head, I literally had the strings with where you attach them to the cups, and you listen. But I'm like, that is such a nice, easy way to say, like, look, we need to have an interface that both these things can talk to each other, that they understand, right? And I'm like, yeah, that's okay. And then it needs some way that they can communicate with each other. And then they did a good job of talking about, hey, well, you know what? We wouldn't want to just let everyone access everything, right? We want to have some security, right? So you'd lock it down a bit. They get into different types of GET requests versus POST requests, and then talk about and maybe they're right now, because they mentioned it's almost always JSON now. It's just type of data you're returning, which I know it used to be XML, and now JSON is dominant. I was surprised that he said it's almost always JSON, or I forget exactly how he worded it, but I know it's very common JSON. Maybe it has become so standard that it's JSON now is the norm, by far the norm.
Yeah, it's probably connected to Java being a part of the web for so long, and JavaScript and JSON and people being used to that format. Maybe that's the thing.
Yep. And then they talk about how to use an API, right? And they give a couple examples, which, and it's funny because this article came out. I was helping that landlord group I was mentioning earlier. I was talking to them about automating texting, and I actually recorded a video to using a tool, and I thought about making another video to help explain if you wanted to do some custom tracking and how you can use the Pretty Links, program, if you have a WordPress site, to build trackable links, because in Pretty Links you can have the what are they called? The I'm blanking on the names, but the key value pairs after the URL.
Yeah.
And so you could automate populating that value and be able to track, who like clicked the link. And that's basically what they're getting into here with the whole question mark host equals, and then, your key value pairs with how you send data.
Yeah.
And how it interprets it. And then, of course, so you're sending a query string, and whether that's in the URL or the payload, right? And that's where the post request, correct me if I'm in, the post request is in a quote unquote envelope, or the payload where it's not as easy for someone to see the data. Is that right? It's more protected than if it goes in the actual URL.
Oh yeah, you can. Yeah, that's the thing. You can at least protect it if you do it as the payload. Where in URL you're limited to how the internet works, the HTTP protocol actually works. So yeah.
So let's see. They go in here and they have an example with JavaScript. I think one with Python. Show a little bit of PHP as well, and show you the similarities. That's why I kind of like this, was they actually showed you in a couple different languages. Some languages like PHP, and I think it was JSON, have built-in ways. Well, actually, that's right, because they used the JSON query. They did it first in JSON, and then they did it with JSON query and showed a little more efficient way, I think, to do it. But then they said, like in Python, you actually have to go get a library. I think it's the request library. And to do it, what of course not in here is AutoHotkey, which by the way, let me show you. No, that's not it. Hold on. There we go. So I was playing around a little. This was the example I borrowed from, and I just created the COM object. I don't have a query string because in this example we didn't have one, and I put the endpoint, and I like in 2 seconds I tried this, and I can launch it here and run it. And now, you know what? Let me change this to first show it where we don't make the output. Actually, I shouldn't. I can leave that one. Come on, I can leave that one going because it won't matter. But I'm going to display the output in the output screen down here. So this is the JSON string that got returned, right? Yeah. And it's long and it's difficult to read, but it is the data that was returned. But what I can do is, instead of showing it that way, I'm going to run it through this parsing JSON function and make it a little prettier. And so this dumps it into an AutoHotkey. I don't know if I saved that. There we go, an AutoHotkey object, and then breaks it out, and so we can easily look at what was there. And so anyway, it's an example of how you would do it in AutoHotkey instead of with Python or whatever you're using. But yeah, JSON is very easy to work with.
Exactly. And again, if it's fairly simple, here people on your example sees a lot of stuff that's commented out and all that, but it's only the lines that are really in color here, where your default settings, that's not needed, but the endpoint, the COM object create, the open and the send are really the lines that are most important here. So almost nothing is needed to do the exact same thing. And by doing this, you make something that resembles what's on the article that we just looked at. It's and it really depends on what you need to do with it, and you're parsing the JSON, that's a line, but if you just needed a specific value, you could probably use in string split. You could use all kinds of different things to actually get values out of the JSON. Here, you're just building an AutoHotkey object from the JSON, and makes it really easy to work with. And to me, it's like, here you have what's really the thing, because the endpoint could actually be located there, and by doing it that way, you're down to actually only using 3 lines to actually do the stuff, and 4 lines if you want to do stuff with it. So that is almost as little as it gets, right? Because the examples on the article actually don't do anything with the information for the most part.
Right.
I think the Python example was import request, and then it send a request. That's the 2 lines that were in the article. And yeah, exactly right. So with 4 lines of code, you actually have the information that you wanted. And to me, that's not really that hard. It's
Right.
fairly simple to.
Yeah, and so to back up a step, one is we have a webinar on APIs, and so we go deep in that if you want to go watch that. I also have a lot of examples on using API calls that you can go watch and check that out. I also, that's why when we first noticed this, I have a API syntax writer, and so in that, so I'm gonna hit a menu here. This is my example when HTTP request. That was why I had all that stuff in there that Jackie said, like, that's all not needed. I put it there because a lot of times you need a lot of these headers, and it's just, hey, you know what? I have my little template here, and then I have in that writing tool a lot of other ones, like, oh, you know what? They said you need to set an authorization bearer token or cookies or whatever, right? So I have built this so it's easy to work with and stuff. But yeah, for the most part, I mean, Jackie's spot on, right? You don't need all that other stuff. Let me go back to the other one. Oh, where'd it go? Is it that one?
I think you just did it in the actual one.
Oh, did I?
Oh, no, it's the GitHub API example. The 4th one
you.
from the top there.
Right, yeah. So for this example, you're right. This is all you need. It's just, of course, it gets back to what are you solving for, and if you have this one-off thing and you just want to look up one thing and you do the exact value, that's where, yeah, in-string will be perfectly fine. Go look for the thing you want, pull back that little piece you want, and you're good to go, right?
Yeah, and AutoHotkey has a very simple command as well. What was it? URL download or something? I don't use it anymore.
No, me either. But right.
Yeah. Where that's a GET request that's done right there. It's pretty simple. You hit an endpoint and it returns whatever that endpoint gives you. And if it's a normal web page, it will return the web page response text, and that would most likely be, in this case, it would be JSON if you did that. And that's a way of doing it with less control, but even fewer lines of code. It's just so AutoHotkey can do it really, really simple. Let's say you wanted to get the Greenwich Mean Time currently. Just instead of trying to make calculations with variables and stuff, you want to have your script able to sync with some kind of online clock.
Mm-hmm.
You could use this to just pull that in, and then your script would have what the time was somewhere else in the world. And of course, you have built-in variables to tell you parts of it. I think we have now UTF or whatever. What was it called? What's that called? UTC or?
Yeah, now UTC. Yeah.
Yeah, which is the universal time count or something, whatever that stands for.
Maybe, but yeah.
Yeah. But again, so it was just an example for something that might make sense. But if you're pulling something simple back from the internet, an entire web page without something dynamic going on, yeah, you can do it very simple. But if you're trying to do something on a web page where you want to do something like here, where you might want to pull back whatever the API gives you,
let's just pretend that that it broke it out this way, where we could say where post equals 4, right? Well, let's say if that was the way that their thing worked, we could only pull back my 4th post,
Yeah.
Right. And this allows you to Jackie's point. Now, that still might actually work with the URL download to what's the damn call again?
I try and see. I don't remember what's
Yeah,
called.
but it's there.
Can you maybe start the command or something? Roll something.
Download the file. Okay.
And
I know there's a version of to download to var. Maystruth actually was the one I believe that wrote it initially, but that one will go down. Just to FYI, when years and years ago, this is one of the first things I was trying to do when I was at TI. I was trying to do this stuff, and for some reason, when I was behind a proxy, I couldn't do it at work. I could run it at home and it worked fine, and this wouldn't work. And so I had to switch over and learn about the whole not post request, but the actual object using the WinHTTP request, because this one it just wouldn't load. It was really weird.
Yeah, and I don't know the inner workings of that exactly, but it has something to do with, as you said yourself, proxies, and it has to do with if there is a redirect at the address, it might not allow redirects, where that's something you can control with the WinHTTP request and stuff like that. Right. So you might be able to do the most simple things, but yeah, you couldn't use URL download to file if you wanted to put something. If you actually wanted to send a payload to an API, as an example, or so yeah, the URL to file or download to file is limited in what you can do with it. But if it's a simple matter of scraping a very standard web page, then it can work. And if you want to get a value from an API call, then it could probably also work. But that's about the extent of what you can do with that command. And after that, it's time for the WinHTTP request.
And just say if this is all new to you, you've probably never run into it. But Jackie mentioned that dealing with redirects. I've had times where using the COM object from line 3, it wouldn't work. And what was happening was my COM object would go out and connect to the server. What I needed to do was to actually stop it from getting redirected and take the response I got there and then use it in my next step. And so a browser and the browser, of course, is the API call also. So a browser automatically does this, but this COM object doesn't automatically do that for you. And so that is where that on line 11, it prevents it, and then you take the response and then you use it, and because usually they'll give you your next endpoint to go to, and you take that response and you use something with it. And so it's one of those things, to Jackie's point, the URL download the file, it's cool because if it does solve your problem, it's very succinct and easy and fast, yet there's not a lot of flexibility with it.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Where when you begin moving into APIs, it's a lot of the time it's not a matter of you just wanting to get something. Where URL download to file is mostly the get function, where if you actually want to post something or send something, then you'd need to move into something a bit more complex, like this WinHTTP one. And a lot of time, that's what you want to do. You want to give the API some kind of information, and sometimes it can be done as a parameter in the URL. And if that's possible, you could probably still use URL download to file. But again, if you want to actually deliver a payload in the send, and then you're at a loss.
Well, and even then, even though the URL download to var, which isn't a built-in command, but it's just a function, the URL download to file is going to save it as a file, and then you have to read that file in, and so it's just more work you're doing. If you just want to grab a piece and have it in memory and use it as a variable, use it whatever, right? That's where, again, the COM object is just, it's really great for.
Yeah, and of course, you can work around needing to have temporary files and stuff, but it just becomes a matter of maybe principle for the most part, because if you download it to WAR and have it in memory, you still have the entire thing on your computer. So it doesn't really matter if you put it on the hard drive or not, but there can be a bit of speed stuff. And then there can be, if it's a script that you're sharing with other people, then you might not want to really create new files on their system. And how about what types of access do you really have, and so on and so forth.
Awesome. Well, again, this one, let's go ahead and keep it a little shorter than our other short, long talks. Because we have the API webinar, or did we even do more than one? I don't remember. I know we did 2 on web scraping, right, and 1 on APIs. Okay, maybe we'll do another one on APIs again, because it is a really fun topic. It opens up so many doors, and there's, I'm sure if we went back to that one source in the webinar, we demonstrated, and I think at the time there was roughly 17,000 APIs that were public APIs that you can use. I'll bet you now it's probably doubled, or at least over 50% higher on how many APIs are out there. It's just a crazy amount.
Yeah, and to me, even when we're showing this web service API, or how to use this COM object create in HTTP thing, it gets back to what we've talked about before, is that even COM, which is the common object module or whatever model, is actually an API. Even though it depends on how you look at it, it is a common object model. It's a specific way of building functionality, just like with Dells and stuff like that. It's a matter of building it the same way so others can call it. With APIs, it's the same thing. You have specific entry points, and by documenting your API, others can use it. And so, yeah.
Well, and I think that was one thing I think we hadn't talked about it, but we both didn't like about this article in the bit of sense is just they should have done a better job, to me, explaining there are programmatic APIs, and that's a really, really common thing too. And so don't get confused, because I know when a guy that I was doing some pro coding with and stuff, we were talking about APIs, and he's like, oh yeah, and then I think he said Python's API, and I'm like, Python doesn't have an API. Like, I don't understand. How would I connect to it? Blah blah blah. And then I finally was like, wait a minute. Yeah, to me, APIs to me are the web service APIs, right? They're online servers, are not a program. And of course he was right, but it was in my head, I was just thinking totally of web service APIs, and those are by far, like for most people now, that's what the average person is discussing they might use and leverage. They're not connecting to another program, but those are, and that's what I wish he'd done a little bit better job here in this article, saying there are all these different types of Windows has an API, and even the Windows API is, to me, illy defined, because there's so many ways you can connect to Windows and programmatically interact with it, right? Like we talked about it with the post and send messages versus even the ribbon button. There's so many ways in AutoHotkey that you can connect to different things, right? Like the ACC viewer, and there's the other one, the newer version of that. And I mean, there's a lot of things. Technically, I think those all qualify.
Yeah. It's at least someone trying to do something structured that others can follow. And of course, as the world becomes more complex, what people try to build on top of it and to simplify it might also be more complex. But the end goal is always to make as many people able to do it as possible, I think. And here, this site is called Cloud Savvy or something, IT. And of course, he's gonna focus on cloud APIs. That kind of makes sense. But when you just claim what is an API, then I'm not even sure he actually mentions what API stands for.
That's hilarious. I don't think he does.
So he mentions APIs and programming and stuff.
That's funny. He doesn't.
he never really says that it's an application programmable interface or something like that. And
yeah,
that's because that's not how he views it. He
right.
just sees it as a way to
Yeah.
access
Yeah.
other web services.
Yeah.
Just,
that's hilarious, which is also why I overall liked this article, because that's also how I think of them.
Yeah.
But I know it's not, you know, there are plenty of APIs, and we do, I mean, I've used them in other ways, but I just don't think of those as APIs, because
no,
to me
but
they're
SQL is, that's actually
interesting.
That kind of an API, right?
Right.
Even though it's an SQL database is database structured in a specific way that you can then query into, but querying into it is kind of like using the database API.
I think, you know, I think what would differ is in that case, you're using the one language, you know, your SQL, to connect to the database, and with APIs, you have something that's the intermittent, like, you know, you have something that's communicating between them.
Yeah, and to me, it's like, let's say I'm using the ADO.
Oh yeah.
So that's, I'm not really sure. I'm using AutoHotkey, accessing the ADO
Right.
to connect to the SQL database and using SQL queries to actually get the data back. Which part of that is the API? I'm not sure, but it's still kind of what's going on.
Yeah. ADO, if you're not aware, is I'm not sure what the letters stand for, but it application database object, maybe. It's a built-in database that Windows has that you can run SQL queries on, and like open text files and do SQL on them and join files and stuff. It's really cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this one. This was fun and interesting, though. Thanks, Jackie.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Bye.
Yeah, bye.